The hum of the ventilation system cuts through the silence of the sterile interview room at the Ottawa Police Headquarters. It is Sunday, February 7th, 2010. In the center of the frame sits Colonel Russell Williams, the commander of CFB Trenton, a man who had piloted aircraft for the Queen of England. His posture is relaxed, his demeanor projecting the practiced authority of a high-ranking military officer who believes he is untouchable. For months, a phantom predator had paralyzed the Tweed community, escalating from intrusive lingerie thefts to the brutal sexual assaults and murders of Corporal Marie-France Comeau and 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd. The massive manhunt involved thousands of roadside checks and an exhaustive forensic analysis of tire treads on snowy backroads. Yet, the resolution comes down to this claustrophobic space. Across the table, Detective Sergeant Jim Smyth is systematically dismantling a double life with quiet, lethal efficiency. We are witnessing the precise sequence where arrogance dissolves into calculation, and calculation finally collapses into total defeat. This is the anatomy of a confession, tracing the microscopic psychological tremors that occur when a serial killer realizes the door has locked behind him forever. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To understand the magnitude of the collapse, one must first understand the height of the pedestal. In the frozen landscape of eastern Ontario, amidst the harsh winter of 2010, Colonel David Russell Williams stood at the apex of a distinguished military career. He was not merely an officer. He was the commander of CFB Trenton, the largest and busiest Air Force base in Canada. He was a man who commanded the respect of thousands, a decorated pilot who had flown Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip during their 2005 royal tour, and a logistical expert entrusted with the nation's most sensitive defense assets. To his neighbors in the quiet municipality of Tweed, he was Dave, the polite and unassuming cottager who shoveled his walkway with precision and waved from the driveway of his pristine home on Cozy Cove Lane. This was the facade, the meticulously constructed armor of respectability that Hervey Cleckley famously described as the mask of sanity. It was a mask so seamless and so polished that it deflected not only suspicion, but the very possibility of deviance. Underneath the decorated uniform and the calm demeanor of a high-ranking officer, however, existed a compartmentalized reality of escalating depravity. The psychological bifurcation of Russell Williams is a case study in the clinical application of discipline to disorder. Williams did not simply snap. His descent was a slow, calculated gradation of criminal behavior that ran parallel to his professional ascent. While he was managing flight schedules and international logistics for the Canadian Forces, he was simultaneously managing a secret portfolio of fetishism and intrusion. Between 2007 and 2009, Williams engaged in a spree of residential break-ins in the Ottawa suburb of Orléans, and later in the Tweed area. These were not burglaries motivated by financial gain. They were extraction missions for a pathological obsession. Williams would break into homes, often when the occupants were absent, to steal women's lingerie. The clinical nature of these crimes distinguished them from the work of a disorganized, chaotic offender. Williams applied the same rigor to his deviance that he applied to his military command. He did not merely steal, he catalogued. He took hundreds of photographs of himself at the crime scenes, wearing the stolen garments, posing in the bedrooms of his unknowing victims. He organized these digital trophies on hard drives with proper noun file names and dates, creating a structured archive of his violations. This urge to document, to witness himself in the act of transgression, speaks to a profound narcissism and a desire to retain ownership over the violation long after he had left the premises. At work, he was a man of rules. In the shadows, he was rewriting the social contract to suit a private, perverse script. By 2009, the mask remained firmly in place, but the pathology demanded escalation. The static thrill of burglary and fetishism began to yield diminishing returns. The threshold for satisfaction moved, crossing the line from property crime to violent interpersonal assault. In September of that year, the shadows of Tweed grew darker. Williams broke into a home on Cozy Cove Lane, not far from his own residence, where he assaulted a woman in her bedroom. He bound her, blindfolded her, and photographed her, forcing her to pose for his collection. He did not kill her. He left her alive, traumatized, and terrified, vanishing back into the night and back into his life as the base commander. The police were baffled. The predator left few forensic traces, and the idea that a sexual predator was operating in such a tight-knit, rural community instilled a pervasive dread in the region. The escalation continued with a terrifying geometric precision. The leap from sexual assault to homicide occurred only 2 months later. In November 2009, Williams targeted Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 37-year-old military flight attendant who served under his own command at CFB Trenton. This choice of victim displayed a brazen arrogance. He was hunting within his own territory, preying on a subordinate. He broke into her home in Brighton, Ontario, and subjected her to a prolonged assault before asphyxiating her. The murder of Marie-France Comeau shattered the illusion of safety within the military community, yet the investigation stalled. The police profile likely skewed toward a loner, a drifter, or someone with a known history of violence, not the base commander who would later stand solemnly at her funeral, comforting her grieving colleagues with a practiced face of mourning. The dichotomy of his existence during this period is chilling in its absolute normalcy. Williams continued to attend briefings, sign performance evaluations, and host dinner parties. He piloted aircraft and managed the complexities of the relief effort for the earthquake in Haiti. There was no bleed-through of the monster into the man. He did not appear agitated or erratic. His pulse, one can imagine, remained as steady in the briefing room as it was when he stalked the snowy streets of Tweed. This ability to completely segregate his atrocities from his daily life is the hallmark of the psychopath. A total lack of affective empathy that allows the individual to mimic human emotion without ever truly feeling the weight of conscience. The final act of his violent trajectory began in late January 2010. Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman working for a school bus transportation company, lived on Highway 37, a main artery running through the region. Williams had been stalking her. He had observed her routines, noting when she was alone. On the night of January 28th, he broke into her home. The violence that ensued was prolonged and documented with the same horrific fidelity as his previous crimes. He eventually transported her body to his cottage on Cozy Cove Lane before disposing of her remains in a wooded area nearby. The disappearance of Jessica Lloyd triggered a massive mobilization of law enforcement and community search parties. Posters with her face were stapled to telephone poles across the county. The community of Tweed was paralyzed by the realization that a serial predator was among them. It was the geography of the investigation that began to erode the mask. The Ontario Provincial Police set up roadside canvases, stopping motorists on Highway 37 to ask if they had seen anything unusual on the night Lloyd vanished. The net was wide, casting for any discrepancy in the timeline of the night. It was a standard procedural tactic, a sift of the general population to find a grain of truth. In the process of these checks, officers noted tire tracks in the fresh snow near Jessica Lloyd's home. They were distinctive treads belonging to a specific make and model of SUV. The forensic team cast the impressions, looking for a match in a sea of winter tires. Officers identified the tire tracks as belonging to a Nissan Pathfinder. It was a common vehicle, but in the rural stillness of a January night, the presence of any car was significant. During a routine roadside stop days later, officers stopped a Nissan Pathfinder. The driver was polite, cooperative, and incredibly respectable. He identified himself as Colonel David Russell Williams, commander of CFB Trenton. To a patrol officer, this identification usually signals the end of suspicion. A man of such stature is presumed to be above the grime of a criminal investigation. However, the tire treads on his vehicle matched the impressions found in the snow near the abduction site. This singular piece of physical evidence created a dissonance that the investigators could not ignore. It was an impossibility that demanded resolution. The pillar of the community was driving the vehicle of the suspect. On Sunday, February 7, 2010, the police invited Williams to the Ottawa Police Headquarters for a formalized interview. He was not under arrest. He drove himself there, expecting perhaps to talk his way out of a misunderstanding, or to use his rank to deflect the scrutiny. He wore his confidence like a second skin. He believed in the impenetrability of his own persona. He believed that the colonel could never be confused with the killer. As he walked into the interrogation room, the environment was sterile. Carpeted walls, a small table, a few chairs. It was a space designed to strip away social standing and reduce a subject to their raw psychological state. Williams sat down, composed, hands clasped, projecting the helpful demeanor of a senior officer assisting the police with their difficult work. He was prepared to offer alibis, to discuss his movements with the vague precision of a busy man. He did not know that the police had already connected the digital dots, that the tire tracks were merely the first thread in a tapestry of evidence that was rapidly unraveling. He did not know that teams were simultaneously executing search warrants at his Ottawa residence and his Tweed cottage, where the hidden hard drives and the souvenirs of his double life lay waiting. The background of Russell Williams is not a story of a monster hiding in a cave. It is a story of a monster hiding in plain sight, illuminated by the spotlight of public adoration. The mask of sanity was not just a disguise. It was a fully operational persona that allowed him to navigate the highest corridors of power while harboring the darkest of human impulses. As the door to the interview room clicked shut, the context was set. The background, the years of theft, the escalation to assault, the murders of Comeau and Lloyd, sat invisible in the room with him. The narrative of the distinguished colonel was about to collide violently with the reality of the serial sexual sadist. The stage was set for a battle of wits where rank would hold no currency, and where the meticulous documentation he prized so highly would become the architect of his destruction. The interrogation was about to begin, and the mask was about to slip. The timeline of the final unraveling began not with a scream, but with the quiet friction of a stolen credit card and a falsified identity. By January 1978, the man known to law enforcement across the American West as Theodore Robert Bundy had ceased to exist in any functional legal capacity. He was now Chris Hagen, a driftless shadow moving through the humid chill of Tallahassee, Florida. Having escaped from the Garfield County Jail in Colorado just weeks prior, the carefully constructed mask of the aspiring lawyer and Republican Party insider had been discarded. What remained was a feral, compulsive core that had been starved of its violent outlets during incarceration. The psychological decompensation was rapid. Living in a rundown rooming house on West College Avenue, barely blocks from the Florida State University campus, the subject spent his days sleeping and his nights prowling the perimeter of the university district, fueled by cheap alcohol and the escalating pressure of his own pathology. The spree, a term that implies a sudden burst of activity, was in this case a catastrophic explosion of suppressed rage. The date was Saturday, January 14, 1978. The subject spent the evening at a local tavern, The Oak, drinking heavily and observing the student population. Witnesses would later recall a man staring blankly, blending into the ambient noise of college life. As the bars closed and the streets emptied, the transition from observer to active predator occurred. He did not return to his rooming house. Instead, he moved toward the Chi Omega sorority house at 661 West Jefferson Street. It was a large two-story structure housing 36 women, currently silent in the pre-dawn hours of January 15th. The mechanism of entry was opportunistic. The locking mechanism on the rear door was defective, a mechanical failure that would facilitate a massacre. At approximately 2:45 a.m., the subject entered the building. He carried a distinct weapon, a length of oak firewood scavenged from a pile outside, wrapped in nothing but his own intent. The clinical brutality that followed was marked by silence and speed. He first encountered the room of 21-year-old Margaret Bowman. The attack was immediate. The subject struck Bowman repeatedly with the oak bludgeon while she slept. The cranial trauma was severe and ultimately fatal, rendering her unconscious before any defensive wounds could be inflicted. He then tightened a nylon stocking around her neck, a ritualistic signature that served no functional purpose other than total dominance. He left her dead and moved to the room opposite. Inside, 20-year-old Lisa Levy was asleep. The violence inflicted upon Levy demonstrated a marked escalation in frenzy. In addition to the blunt force trauma and strangulation, the subject engaged in sexual battery and, crucially for the dragnet that would follow, bit the victim on the left buttock. This act was not merely an assault, but a forensic transfer. The unique dentition of the attacker, specifically a chipped incisor and the rotation of the lower teeth, was pressed into the victim's flesh, leaving a biological blueprint that would later serve as the primary instrument of his legal destruction. The entire sequence in these two rooms transpired in less than 15 minutes. The spree continued within the same structure. Moving down the hallway, he entered a room shared by Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. The element of surprise remained, but the fatigue of the physical exertion began to show. He attacked Kleiner, breaking her jaw and lacerating her shoulder, then turned on Chandler, inflicting severe head trauma. However, headlights from a vehicle entering the sorority parking lot swept across the bedroom window. The sudden illumination triggered the subject's flight response. He abandoned the attack on Kleiner and Chandler, leaving them alive amidst the carnage, and fled down the stairs. As he exited the front foyer, he was spotted in profile by Nita Neary, a sorority sister returning home. Neary saw a man in a knit cap clutching a log, his profile etched against the dim light of the doorway. This visual identification would become a cornerstone of the subsequent prosecution, but in the immediate moment, it was merely a fleeting image of a monster vanishing into the night. The geographical footprint of the spree expanded almost immediately. The subject did not retreat to safety. The neurochemical drive for violence had not been satiated. He travelled 8 blocks west to a duplex on Dunwoody Street. It was now approximately 4:30 a.m. He broke into the basement apartment of Cheryl Thomas, a dance student. The pattern repeated, blunt force trauma to the head while the victim slept. The force was so significant that Thomas would suffer permanent hearing loss and equilibrium damage, ending her dance career. However, neighbors heard the rhythmic thumping of the attack and called the police. By the time officers arrived, the subject had fled through a window, leaving behind a pantyhose mask, but no fingerprints. In the span of 90 minutes, he had attacked 5 women, killing 2, and evaporated into the Tallahassee grid. The dragnet that mobilized in the wake of the Chi Omega murders was one of the most intensive in Florida history, yet it was initially paralyzed by a lack of specific intelligence. Leon County Sheriff Ken Katsaris and the Tallahassee Police Department were dealing with a crime scene of immense chaotic complexity. The sorority house was a labyrinth of evidence: blood spatter, hair fibers, the wooden club, and the bite mark. However, they did not know they were hunting Theodore Bundy. The FBI's 10 most wanted list included him, but the connection between the sophisticated escapee from Colorado and the savage bludgeoner of Tallahassee was not immediately drawn. The profile seemed inconsistent. Bundy was known for abduction and stealth, not blitz attacks in crowded houses. The investigation operated on a dual track: forensic analysis and frantic public safety management. The university campus was locked down. The panic in the community was palpable, with hardware stores selling out of deadbolts and window locks within hours. Sheriff Katsaris coordinated a task force that began processing thousands of tips. They had Nita Neary's description and the composite sketch that followed: a man with a sharp nose and a knit cap. But the physical evidence was frustratingly abstract. The sperm samples recovered were from a non sequitur, meaning blood type could not be determined from the fluid alone. The hair samples were inconclusive. The bite mark was photographed with a scale and preserved, but without a suspect's dentition for comparison. It was a lock without a key. For 3 weeks, the subject remained in Tallahassee, living inside the perimeter of the dragnet. He stole cars and license plates, rotating them to avoid detection. He monitored the news reports, feeding on the fear he had generated. However, his resources were dwindling. The stolen credit cards were burnt, and the heat from the investigation was becoming suffocating. On February 8th, the subject stole a white Ford F-250 van belonging to the FSU Media Center. The theft of a government vehicle was a desperate error. He abandoned his rooming house and drove east, leaving the immediate containment zone of Tallahassee, but entering a wider, more dangerous highway patrol surveillance grid. The spree entered its final tragic phase in Lake City, Florida. On the morning of February 9th, 1978, the subject was no longer operating under the cover of darkness. The decompensation was total. The careful planning of his earlier years had dissolved into pure impulse. At approximately 9:00 a.m., 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was summoned to her homeroom at Lake City Junior High to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned. Witnesses saw a man leading a young girl toward a white van. The brazen nature of the abduction, in daylight, on school grounds, signaled a killer who had ceased to care about self-preservation. The response to the Leach abduction was a massive escalation of the dragnet. The Florida Highway Patrol, the FBI, and local agencies established a corridor of surveillance along the interstates. The white van became the most hunted object in the southeast. Realizing the vehicle was a liability, the subject abandoned it and the body of Kimberly Leach in Suwannee River State Park. He continued his flight in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, the same model that had been his signature vehicle in the Pacific Northwest, a subconscious return to the roots of his pathology. The dragnet was now closing on a mathematical probability. The sheer volume of stolen vehicles, stolen plates, and credit card attempts created a trail of data points that law enforcement was tracking with increasing speed. The FBI provided behavioral consultation, suggesting that the killer was likely a transient, highly mobile, and rapidly deteriorating. The geographic profile pointed west, toward the Alabama border. The end came not through a brilliant deduction by detectives in a command center, but through the routine vigilance of a beat cop in Pensacola. It was February 15, 1978, at 1:00 a.m. Officer David Lee was patrolling a quiet residential district when he observed an orange Volkswagen driving suspiciously slowly, checking the doors of local businesses. A license plate check revealed the vehicle was stolen. Officer Lee initiated a traffic stop. The subject pulled over. The interaction that followed was the collision of the spree and the dragnet. Officer Lee ordered the driver out of the vehicle and onto the pavement. The subject initially complied, lying prone. However, as Lee moved to cuff him, the survival instinct flared. The subject kicked Officer Lee's legs out from under him, knocking him to the ground. A violent struggle ensued on the asphalt. The subject, adrenaline-fueled, fought for the officer's service weapon. It was a primal grapple for dominance. Officer Lee, realizing he was fighting for his life, fired a warning shot and managed to subdue the subject with a strike to the head, even as he was handcuffed and placed in the rear of the patrol car. The identity of the man was unknown to the Pensacola police. He identified himself as Kenneth Misner, a pseudonym. He was bloody, exhausted, and cornered. The realization that it was over did not happen in that car. It happened slowly, in the interrogation room, as the layers of deception were peeled away by the mechanics of the justice system. The dragnet phase shifted from the streets to the laboratory. Once the subject's true identity as Theodore Bundy was confirmed, the full weight of the multi-state apparatus descended upon him. The realized horror of the authorities that the Chi Omega killer and the escaped Colorado killer were one and the same galvanized the prosecution. The bite mark on Lisa Levy became the focal point. Forensic odontologists Dr. Richard Suveran and Dr. Lowell Levine were brought in. In a procedure defined by clinical humiliation and absolute precision, the subject was served with a search warrant for his own mouth. Photographers and dentists mapped the landscape of his teeth, documenting the chipped incisor and the jagged crowding of the lower jaw. When the acetate overlay of Bundy's teeth was placed over the photograph of the bite mark on Lisa Levy, the match was perfect. The dragnet had caught him, not just physically, but biologically. The realization for the subject was a slow, dawning horror. The intellect he had prided himself on, the legal acumen he thought would save him, was useless against the immutable fact of his own anatomy. The spree had been a chaotic release of impulse. The dragnet was a cold, systematic constricting of the noose. The events of January and February 1978 dismantled the myth of the genius killer, exposing a desperate, violent drifter who left a trail of evidence that made his capture inevitable. The silence of the Chi Omega house and the empty desk of Kimberly Leach were the grim monuments to the time it took for the system to catch up to the man. The aftermath of the capture required a forensic excavation of the subject's movements during those 30 days. Investigators had to retroactively piece together the map of the spree to ensure the capital murder charges would stick. This involved a meticulous reconstruction of the timeline, utilizing receipt scraps, gas station sightings, and the physical degradation of the stolen vehicles. The orange Volkswagen Beetle, recovered in Pensacola, was processed with a thoroughness that bordered on the microscopic. Inside, fiber evidence linked the car to the clothing of Kimberly Leach, and soil samples from the wheel wells placed the vehicle at the remote location where her remains would eventually be found. This phase of the investigation highlighted the sheer scope of the dragnet in its administrative form. It wasn't just men with dogs in the woods. It was a bureaucratic encirclement. The state of Florida, embarrassed by the initial escape and the brutality of the crimes, allocated unlimited resources to the prosecution. State Attorney Harry Morrison and his team began building a case that relied less on confession, which Bundy would withhold for years, and more on the irrefutable circumstances of time and place. They mapped the credit card usage of the Chris Hagen persona, overlaying it with the known locations of the attacks. The resulting chart showed a predator circling his prey, moving with terrifying proximity to the student populations of Tallahassee and Lake City. The psychological state of the subject during this confinement was a study in narcissism under siege. Denied the freedom to move and kill, he attempted to manipulate the legal proceedings, acting as his own attorney. This was the final act of the spree, a courtroom spree, where he attempted to charm, bully, and outwit the judicial process. But the dragnet held firm. The tangible evidence collected during the manhunt, the fibers, the eyewitness accounts from Nita Neary, and the dental impressions, formed a cage he could not talk his way out of. The investigation also revealed the near misses, the moments where the spree could have been terminated earlier, a traffic stop that didn't happen, a suspicious person report that was filed too late, a credit card transaction that wasn't flagged in real time. These administrative gaps were closed in the wake of the Bundy case, changing how law enforcement agencies communicated across state lines. The realization that a serial killer could cross the country, escaping custody and resuming his patterns immediately, forced a modernization of the FBI's violent criminal apprehension program. In the final analysis of the events of early 1978, the narrative is one of a desperate acceleration. The subject knew, on some level, that Florida was the terminus. The reckless abandon of the Chi Omega attack, leaving witnesses and biological evidence, and the daylight abduction of Kimberly Leach, spoke of a killer who had exhausted his own capacity for caution. He was running toward the end. When Officer David Lee knocked him to the ground in Pensacola, it wasn't just an arrest. It was the collapse of a psychological structure that could no longer sustain itself. The spree was the fire, consuming everything in its path, including the killer's own discipline. The dragnet was the water, slow to arrive but overwhelming in its final volume, extinguishing the threat and leaving only the cold, hard facts of the crime scene to be judged. The legacy of this specific chapter in criminal history is defined by the collision of these two forces, the chaotic, organic violence of the offender and the rigid, inorganic grid of the state. The victims, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Kimberly Leach, and the survivors, were caught in the friction point between a man losing control and a system struggling to gain it. The clinical details of the autopsies, the measurements of the bite marks, and the timestamps on the police logs serve as the enduring record of the moment. The modern age of serial murder investigation truly began. It was the moment law enforcement realized that the monsters were not just myths, but men who could be hunted, catalogued, and ultimately stopped. The final capture in Pensacola brought a deceptive calm. While the physical threat was neutralized, the legal machinery began a grind that would last for a decade. However, the events between January 15th and February 15, 1978, remain the most concentrated distillation of the subject's true nature. Stripped of his charm, his vehicle, and his freedom, he was revealed as a scavenger. The moment it was over was not a singular epiphany, but a series of closing doors. The door of the sorority house locking behind him, the door of the white van sliding shut, and finally, the heavy steel door of the Florida State Prison. The dragnet had worked, the spree was done, and the silence that fell over Tallahassee was no longer one of fear, but of a heavy, grieving resolution. The timeline of a murder investigation is rarely linear, but in the case of Colonel Russell Williams, the commander of Canada's largest Air Force base, the collapse of a double life can be traced to a single Sunday afternoon. It was February 7, 2010, inside a bland, windowless interview room at the Ottawa Police Service headquarters. Across the table from one of the country's most elite military officers sat Detective Sergeant Jim Smyth of the Ontario Provincial Police. The atmosphere was not one of hostile confrontation, but rather a suffocatingly polite conversation that would systematically dismantle a psychopath. Williams had walked into the station believing he was merely a person of interest, a man whose high-ranking status and intelligence would allow him to outmaneuver law enforcement. He wore a fleece sweater and confident demeanor, his posture rigid and military. For hours, Smith employed a technique of feigned empathy and soft-spoken logic, gradually encircling Williams with incontrovertible facts. The conversation drifted from the roadside checks to Williams's tires, specifically the unique tread patterns found in the snow near the home of Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman who had vanished days earlier. The moment of realization did not arrive with a shout or a slammed fist. It arrived with a photograph. Smith placed a glossy image on the table between them. It showed a distinct boot print found in the snow outside Lloyd's residence. Smyth then pointed to the boots Williams was wearing at that very moment. The detective's voice remained flat and clinical as he explained that the boots on the colonel's feet were a perfect match for the prints at the crime scene. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. In the video recording of the interrogation, Williams freezes. The arrogance that had sustained him through years of fetish burglaries, sexual assaults, and the murder of Corporal Marie-France Comeau evaporated in seconds. His eyes fixed on the photograph, then darted to the floor and finally settled into a 1,000-yard stare. His shoulders slumped, the physical manifestation of a man watching his future dissolve. The illusion of the untouchable commander was gone, replaced by the reality of a cornered predator. He took a long, deep breath, his chest rising and falling in a slow cadence of defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was a husk of its former command. He asked what would happen to his wife. It was an admission of guilt without the word guilty being spoken. From that instant, the dynamic shifted from investigation to debriefing. Williams, ever the military man, began to detail his crimes with a chilling, detached precision. He described the abduction and murder of Jessica Lloyd and the assault and murder of Marie-France Comeau, not with remorse, but with the factual dryness of a mission report. He itemized the equipment used, the timelines followed, and the methods employed to conceal evidence. He drew maps for the detectives to locate Lloyd's body, which he had discarded in a wooded area near Tweed, Ontario. The breakdown in the interrogation room was total. The monster had been unmasked, and he was eager to explain exactly how his machinery worked. The transition from the claustrophobia of the interrogation room to the open theatre of the courtroom in Belleville, Ontario, was rapid. By October 2010, the shock of the revelations had permeated the national consciousness. The trial was not a question of if he did it, but a public accounting of the depths of his depravity. Williams stood before Justice Robert Scott, stripped of his uniform, his rank, and his accolades. The man who had once flown prime ministers and royalty now stood in a prisoner's box, facing the families of the women he had hunted. The courtroom proceedings were grueling. Crown attorneys presented the evidence Williams himself had meticulously catalogued. Thousands of photographs, video recordings of his assaults, and the trophy lingerie he stole from dozens of homes painted a picture of escalation that had gone unchecked for years. The contrast was jarring. The public knew him as a disciplined leader, while the court records revealed a serial sexual predator who documented his crimes with obsessive compulsions. The gallery wept as the details of Marie-France Comeau's final moments were read into the record, followed by the harrowing account of Jessica Lloyd's captivity. Williams remained impassive, a void in the center of the emotional storm he had created. During the sentencing phase, the weight of the evidence allowed for no leniency. The defense offered no excuses, knowing that the confession obtained by Detective Smyth was unassailable. The narrative arc that began with a boot print in the snow concluded with the judge's final address. Justice Robert Scott looked down from the bench, his demeanor grave. He described Williams as a non-reformable predator, a man whose heights of professional success were matched only by the depths of his moral bankruptcy. Justice Scott sentenced Russell Williams to 2 concurrent life sentences for first-degree murder, along with concurrent sentences for sexual assaults and forcible confinement. He would not be eligible for parole for 25 years. The judge's words were sharp and final, designed to ensure that the man who had terrorized the chaotic silence of the interrogation room would never breathe free air again. As the sentence was read, Williams stared blankly ahead. The realization that had struck him months earlier in the police station had now solidified into a permanent reality. The proceedings ended not with a dramatic outburst, but with the quiet shuffling of papers and the click of handcuffs. Officers escorted Williams out of the courtroom, his legacy as a commander erased, replaced by his designation as a serial killer. The breakdown was complete. The legal machinery had finished what Detective Smyth started, processing the facts with a clinical efficiency that mirrored the killer's own methodology, ultimately locking him away in the Poor Cartier institution. The door closed on the case, leaving only the devastation in his wake and the recorded image of a man in a fleece sweater realizing in real time that his life was over. The collapse of Stephen McDaniel's facade in front of a news camera was merely the prologue to a much longer, more arduous legal and emotional procedural. Once the theatrical shock of that viral interview dissipated, the grim machinery of the justice system took over, revealing the full extent of the devastation left in his wake. The investigation that followed his arrest peeled back the layers of a life spent in the shadows, exposing a depth of voyeurism and calculation that disturbed even seasoned detectives in Macon, Georgia. The legacy of the case is not defined by the killer's slip of the tongue, but by the permanent void left in the Giddings family and the sheer brutality masked by a law, students' quiet demeanor. By the time McDaniel stood in the Bibb County Superior Court in April 2014, The erratic behavior seen in his initial interrogation had been replaced by a stone-faced vacancy. He had brokered a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, a legal maneuver that required him to admit to every detail of the crime. For the community of Mercer Law School, this was the moment the intellectual abstract of criminal law collided with the visceral reality of murder. The courtroom was packed, heavy with the stifling air of anticipation and dread. Lauren Giddings' parents, Billy and Karen, sat in the front row, forced to endure the proximity of the man who had watched their daughter from the darkness of his adjacent apartment before extinguishing her bright future. The confession provided by McDaniel was clinical, devoid of the passion or panic usually associated with crimes of passion. It was a step-by-step recitation of a tactical operation. He detailed how he used a master key to enter Lauren's apartment while she slept, how he attacked her, and the methodical way he dismembered her body in the bathtub using a hacksaw. This level of detail served a legal purpose, cementing his guilt beyond appeal. But for the family, it was a secondary trauma. The realization that their daughter's privacy had been invaded long before her death, through video recordings filmed through her window and unauthorized entries into her home, added a psychological horror to the physical violence. The evidence showed McDaniel was not a man who snapped, but a predator who had been hunting. The aftermath of the plea deal brought a complex resolution. While justice was technically served with a life sentence, the limitations of the legal system became painfully apparent. One of the most enduring wounds for the Giddings family is the fact that only Lauren's torso was ever recovered. Despite the confession, the rest of her remains, believed to have been discarded in various trash receptacles and subsequently lost to the vastness of a local landfill, were never found. The search was eventually called off due to hazardous conditions and the sheer impossibility of the task. This lack of physical completeness denied the family a traditional burial, leaving a lingering open-ended grief that no court judgment could close. Judge Howard Sims, who presided over the case, encapsulated the community's revulsion during the sentencing. Breaking the usually neutral demeanor of the bench, Sims looked directly at McDaniel and told him that while he was a smart man, he had been outsmarted by his own arrogance. The judge's words, declaring that McDaniel had essentially become a non-entity, struck at the core of the killer's narcissism. Sims noted that, but for the plea deal, he would have gladly sentenced McDaniel to death. This judicial condemnation stripped away any remaining romanticism or mystery surrounding the law student killer, reducing him to a common butcher. The ripple effects of the murder altered the landscape of the Mercer University campus. The Barristers Hall apartments, where both victim and killer lived, became a macabre landmark before eventually being demolished. The physical erasure of the building was a necessary step for the community to heal, an attempt to scrub the skyline of the tragedy. For the students and the faculty, the case shattered the insulation of academic life. Lauren was a popular, athletic, and driven young woman, the very image of success. Her death forced a realization that intelligence and proximity to the law offered no protection against malevolence. Today, Stephen McDaniel resides in the Georgia penal system, a ghost in the machine of corrections. His attempts to file habeas corpus petitions, arguing procedural errors or ineffective counsel, have been methodically struck down, treated by the courts with the same clinical dismissal he once showed his victim. He spends his days in a maximum security environment, far removed from the legal career he once envisioned. In the silence of his incarceration, the notoriety of his moment on television has faded into the mundane reality of prison life. For the Giddings family, The legacy is not about the killer, but about the preservation of Lauren's memory against the darkness of her exit. They speak of her softball games, her kindness, and her ambition, actively working to ensure she is remembered as a vibrant woman rather than a victim in a true crime vignette. The impact of the crime remains a heavy, static weight, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the terrifying proximity of evil. The moment the killer realized it was over was just a fleeting instance of panic. For those he left behind, the reality of his actions is a life sentence of its own, served in the quiet moments of missing a daughter, a sister, and a friend who was taken too soon. The pathology of Dennis Rader was constructed entirely around a fragile grandiosity, a narcissism that demanded recognition even at the cost of his own freedom. For 3 decades, the man calling himself BTK held Wichita in a grip of manufactured fear, believing his intellect far exceeded that of the detectives hunting him. Yet, the mechanism of his downfall was not a dramatic standoff, but his own desperate need for validation, answering a police lie about a floppy disk because he simply could not bear to be ignored. In the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, the dichotomy between the phantom he projected and the reality of the man was laid bare. As Judge Gregory Waller delivered the weight of 10 consecutive life sentences, the terrifying myth was dismantled by the resilience of those he sought to destroy. Charlie Otero and the families of the 10 victims stood as living testaments to endurance, their collective presence reducing Rader's chaotic legacy to nothing more than the sordid history of a petty tyrant. The power dynamic inverted completely in those final procedural moments. The man who once bound his victims to exert total control was now bound himself, constrained by steel shackles and the rigid protocols of the Kansas Department of Corrections. As he is led away from the bench, shuffling toward the transport that will deposit him in the solitary confinement of the El Dorado Correctional Facility, the camera captures the ultimate erasure of his ego. The predator is gone. All that remains is an elderly inmate, stripped of his pseudonym and his narrative, vanishing behind a heavy steel door that locks with a final, resonant indifference.